The evening of November 16th, 1957, falls heavily on Plainfield, Wisconsin. It's Saturday, and hunting night has just opened. Warden's Hardware is open later than usual. Bernice Warden's, the 58-year-old owner, waits alone behind the counter. The fluorescent lights flicker faintly. The town is empty. Most of the men are in the woods, rifles in hand. A man walks in. He's short, slightly built, with thick glasses that magnify his light eyes. His clothes smell of dampness and isolation. Bernice knows him. It's Ed Gein, the lonely farmer who lives on the outskirts. He's always been strange, quiet, but harmless. Or so she thinks. Ed needs antifreeze, he says. Bernice makes a mental note of the order. He promises to come back later. As he leaves, the door chimes a bell that seems more ominous than usual. Bernice doesn't know she's just seen her killer. Frank Warden's, Bernice's son, returns from his hunting trip that evening. The hardware store is closed, but something isn't right. The back door shows signs of a struggle. Inside, everything seems normal at first glance, except for one disturbing detail. There's a trail of blood leading from the counter to the back of the building. Bernice is not here. Frank runs to Sheriff Archlay's office. His voice trembles as he reports the disappearance. Schley is an experienced man, but Plainfield has barely 700 residents. Violent crimes simply don't happen here. They check the sales ledger. The last entry written by Bernice is clear: antifreeze. There's no name, but Frank remembers Ed Gein asking for antifreeze the previous afternoon. Sheriff Schley looks at his deputy. They both know Ed, the weirdo who's lived alone in that ramshackle farmhouse since his mother died. He never caused any trouble. But that last entry in the ledger is impossible to ignore. The Gein farm is located about 5 miles from downtown Plainfield, at the end of a dirt road that winds through abandoned fields. When the officers arrive that evening, it's pitch black. Their flashlights illuminate a 2-story house that appears to be slowly dying. The white paint is peeling in large slabs. The windows are dirty and opaque. The barn, a huge, ramshackle structure, rises like a wooden skeleton against the night sky. Ed isn't home. The officers decide to check the barn first. Sheriff Schley pushes open a side door. The smell that comes out is indescribable. Rotten meat dampness, something sweet and nauseating that sticks in the throat. The sheriff's flashlight scans the dark interior. There are rusty tools, piles of junk, boxes stacked haphazardly. And then the light stops. Hanging from a beam, upside down like a freshly hunted deer, is a body. The body is decapitated. It has been disemboweled with surgical precision, open from the sternum to the pelvis. The viscera have been completely removed. The ankles are tied with hemp rope. The lantern trembles in the sheriff's hand. It's Bernice Warden's. The deputy vomits in a corner. Schley, with decades of experience, feels his legs weaken. It's not just the brutality of the murder. It's the meticulousness. The way the body has been treated not like a human, but like an animal in a slaughterhouse. But if this is what's in the barn, what's inside the house? The front door of the house is unlocked. The officers enter cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The smell here is different. Dust, damp, something chemical and rancid. The living room is cluttered with trash, old newspapers stacked to the ceiling, rusty cans, and boxes overflowing with meaningless objects. They walk toward the kitchen. The flashlight beam reveals a cold wood stove, dirty pots and pans in the sink, and then, on the table, something that makes the sheriff stop in his tracks. It's a bowl. Inside is something that looks like a shell. But when he looks closer, he realizes what it is. The top of a human skull, polished and turned into a container. This isn't an ordinary crime scene. This is something none of them have ever seen, not even in their nightmares. The officers continue exploring. There are 2 bedrooms upstairs, but only one is sealed from the outside with nails and wooden planks. The orders are clear. Don't touch anything until more help arrives. But curiosity is impossible to contain. In the living room, under a pile of magazines, they find something else. Masks, but not store-bought masks. These are full faces, with real hair still attached, cured using some sort of homemade process. The eyes are sewn shut, the mouths deformed. There are 4 of them. A younger officer asks in a trembling voice, "What kind of monster lives here?" Sheriff Schley has no answers. He only knows that they need to find Ed Gein before nightfall. While the officers search the house, Ed Gein is having dinner at a neighbor's house, Lester Hill, a few miles away. He's calm and polite as always. Lester doesn't suspect a thing. When the officers arrive and arrest him without violence, Ed seems almost relieved. In the patrol car on the way to the station, Ed remains silent. He stares out the window at the dark fields. Finally, Sheriff Schley asks him directly, "Where's Bernice's head?" Ed answers without apparent emotion, as if he were describing the weather. "In the house. In a bag." The silence that follows is deafening. As the sun rises on Sunday, November 17th, entire teams of investigators from Madison arrive at the Gein farm. What they discover in the following hours redefines what Wisconsin authorities considered possible. In the kitchen, they find Bernice Worden's head inside a burlap sack. 2 nails have been driven into her ears, presumably to hang her as a trophy. In Ed's bedroom, among boxes and accumulated junk, is a full vest made of tanned human skin. It has nipples and a navel. It can be worn as a garment. Beside it, a belt made of threaded human nipples, lampshades constructed from facial skin, a shoebox filled with vulvas preserved in salt, and above the bed, a pair of human lips on a string, like a macabre window decoration. The sealed room, the one that was boarded up, turns out to be Ed's mother's bedroom. It's perfectly preserved, like a shrine untouched since the day she died in 1945. The bed is made with military-style corners. Augusta Gein's personal belongings remain exactly where she left them, covered by 12 years of dust. The investigators realize something terrible. They have entered the private museum of a man who never let go of his mother, and who did unspeakable things to fill that void. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He is the second son of George and Augusta Gein. His older brother, Henry, is 7 years old when Ed comes into the world. The family lives in a modest house in a working-class neighborhood. George works sporadically as a tanner, but his true passion is alcohol. Augusta Gein is a woman of extreme religious convictions. A devout Lutheran, she considers the world a place of sin and degeneration. For her, men are weak and women are sources of temptation and evil, except for herself, of course. Her marriage to George is a constant source of bitterness. She despises him for his weakness, his alcoholism, and his inability to provide. From the time Ed was a child, Augusta instilled in him that all women, except her, were instruments of the devil. She read him biblical passages about sin and damnation, particularly those that speak of lust and female corruption. Ed listened quietly, absorbing each word like an immutable gospel. In 1914, when Ed is 8 years old, Augusta makes a decision that will shape the destiny of her children. She buys a 165-acre farm on the outskirts of Plainfield. The money comes from her own savings, not George's. It is a remote property, surrounded by woods and fields, far from what Augusta calls the corrupting influences of the town. The house is large but austere. No electricity for years, no telephone, no luxuries of any kind. Augusta wants her children to grow up isolated from the sinful world. George continues to drink, increasingly absent, more of a shadow than a father. Ed and Henry are homeschooled as much as possible. When they must attend school in Plainfield, they return directly after school. They are not allowed to have friends. They cannot play with other children. Augusta oversees every moment of their lives with military strictness. Neighbors remember Ed as a strangely smiley yet distant child. He never makes full eye contact. He laughs at inappropriate moments. Other students tease him, calling him weird. Ed doesn't fight back. He just smiles. Evenings at the Gein farm follow an invariable ritual. After a meager supper, Augusta gathers her children in the living room for Bible readings. Her voice echoes off the bare walls as she reads Old Testament passages about divine wrath, eternal punishment, and the corrupt nature of humanity. His favorite subjects are the prostitutes of Babylon, the women of ill repute, the temptresses who led righteous men to perdition. Ed listens with rapt attention. Henry, being older and more aware of the unnaturalness of his upbringing, occasionally questions him. Augusta punishes him with grueling physical labor or, worse, icy silence that can last for days. Ed never questions. For him, Mom is the only source of truth in a world he doesn't understand. She's strong, determined, and self-assured, the complete opposite of his father, who staggers around the farm in varying states of intoxication, muttering incoherently. Augusta teaches Ed that sex is the greatest of sins, that women use their bodies to destroy men, that he must remain pure always, or his soul will burn in hell for all eternity. Ed believes every word. On April 1st, 1940, George Gein died. The official cause was heart failure, related to chronic alcoholism. He was 66 years old and had been virtually non-existent in his children's lives for decades. Ed is 33 years old. He shows no particular emotion at the funeral. Henry, now 40, seems more relieved and sad. With George out of the picture, the fire becomes even more Augusta's stranglehold. She doesn't soften with widowhood. If anything, she becomes more rigid. Ed and Henry work as farmhands on neighboring farms to maintain the family estate. Money is tight, but Augusta manages every penny with an iron fist. The siblings have developed different dynamics with their mother. Henry, being older, has begun to see the cracks in the facade. He occasionally makes critical comments about the way Augusta has controlled their lives. He suggests that her extreme religious devotion is unhealthy. Ed gets furious when Henry talks like this. For Ed, questioning Mom is like questioning God himself. On May 16, 1944, a fire broke out in the bushes on the Gein farm. The brothers were working on different sections of the property when the fire started. It was a dry season, and the flames spread quickly, fueled by dead grass and weeds. Ed runs to the village to ask for help. He arrives breathless, with soot on his face, and directs the volunteer firefighters back to farm. By the time they arrive, the fire is already coming under control, having reached a clear area. But Henry doesn't show up. Ed leads the firefighters directly to his brother's body, lying face up in an area missed by the fire. Henry is 43 years old. He's dead. The investigator notices something strange. Henry is lying in an unburned area. There are no fire marks on his body. However, there are bruises on his head. When he asks how Ed knew exactly where to find Henry on 65 acres of land, Ed simply replies that he knew. The county coroner, with limited resources and no apparent reason to suspect parricide, determined the cause of death to be smoke asphyxiation, possibly after being hit on the head while falling through the thick smoke. The case is closed. Neighbors whisper. Some recall tensions between the siblings, particularly Henry's criticism of Augusta, but these are just small-town whispers. No one has any evidence of anything. Ed shows little emotion at Henry's funeral. He stands beside his mother, who is rigid in black, her face a permanent mask of disapproval. When they return to the farm, it's now just the two of them. Ed finally has Mom all to himself. The following year is for Ed the best of his life. Now 38, he devotes every moment to caring for Augusta. She suffers her first stroke in December 1944, shortly after Henry's death. The partial paralysis leaves her weak and dependent. Ed becomes her constant nurse. He feeds her, bathes her, and dresses her. He sleeps on a cot outside her room, listening if she needs him during the night. He reads the same Bible passages she read to him as a child, with the same stern intonation. Augusta, despite her condition, maintains her iron will. She constantly criticizes Ed, his cooking, his clumsiness in helping her, his very existence. But she also depends completely on him, and that gives Ed something he's never had, absolute purpose. Neighbors who see Ed around town comment that he seems almost happy. He smiles more. He does odd jobs as a handyman and occasional babysitter. The town's children aren't afraid of him. Ed is strange, yes, but kind. He tells them stories. He makes them laugh with his exaggerated expressions. No one suspects that inside, Ed is living in the only paradise his mother allowed him to imagine, one where she is the absolute center of the universe. On December 29, 1945, Augusta Gein suffers a second massive stroke. Ed is at her side when it happens. He finds her unconscious in her bed, the left side of her face drooping, her breathing ragged. He runs to the village to seek help, but it's useless. Augusta dies that same afternoon without regaining consciousness. She is 71 years old. Ed Gein's world ends. At the funeral, Ed weeps openly, sobbing like a child. The neighbors feel compassion for the 39-year-old man who has just lost his mother. They don't understand that he's not just crying over a loss. He's crying because the only person who gave him structure, meaning, and conditional, brutal, but real love is gone forever. And Ed Gein doesn't know how to exist in a world without her. When he returns to the farm that night, he walks directly to his mother's bedroom. He locks the door from the outside. He nails boards over frame. That room will never be opened again. It will remain a sealed sanctuary, a fragment of time frozen on the day Mom stopped breathing. But Ed needs to fill the void Augusta left. And over the next 12 years, he'll find unimaginable ways to do so. 1946 marks the beginning of Ed Gein's invisibility. At 40 years old, with no family or close friends, he becomes a peripheral figure in Plainfield. Neighbors occasionally see him at the general store, buying minimal quantities of canned goods, salt, and kerosene for his lanterns. The farm is slowly deteriorating. Ed does odd jobs. Farm helper, babysitting for families in need of emergency supervision. He's odd, true, but reliable at simple tasks. He doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't cause trouble. In a town where everyone knows everyone else, Ed is the man no one really knows. He sleeps in a small room adjacent to the kitchen. The rest of the house gradually fills with trash, old newspapers, magazines, and random objects he collects from local dumps. His mother's bedroom remains sealed, untouched, a sacred reliquary that only Ed can pay homage from the other side of the locked door. At night, Ed reads mail-order crime and anatomy magazines. He develops a particular interest in the Nazis, the medical experiments at the concentration camps, and the graphic descriptions of death and decomposition. It's not that Ed plans to hurt anyone. It's that he needs to fill the empty hours with something that will take his mind off the emptiness Mom left behind. Exactly when it began, no one knows for sure. But sometime between 1946 and 1954, Ed Gein began visiting local cemeteries. Plainfield has 3 small cemeteries within a 20-mile radius. Ed knows them all. He reads newspaper obituaries religiously. He attends funerals of people he barely knew, standing in the back rows, watching. He memorizes the location of fresh graves. And then, on moonless nights, he returns. The process is meticulous. Ed chooses graves of women who remind him of his mother. Similar in age, appearance described in obituaries as respectable or devout. He carries a shovel from a barn. He works in absolute silence, digging for hours. When he reaches a coffin, he pries it open with a crowbar. He doesn't take the entire body. That would be too difficult to transport, too obvious. Instead, he decapitates the corpse with a saw or removes specific parts. The entire torso, the skin of the face, the genitals. He reseals the coffin, partially fills the grave so it's not obvious to the naked eye, and returns to the farm before dawn. Years later, when authorities inspect local cemeteries, they will find at least 9 graves that show signs of having been desecrated. But in 1946, 1947, 1948, no one notices. In the Gein farm barn, Ed develops the skills he learned from his father decades earlier. Hide tanning. George Gein may have been a failed alcoholic, but he was a competent tanner. Ed watched the process as a child. How deerskins are prepared, how they are treated with salt and tannins, how they are stretched and dried. Now, Ed applies those techniques to materials that no professional tanner would ever touch. Human skin is thin, delicate, and difficult to work with, but Ed is patient. He develops his own preservative formulas. He uses salt, alum, and chemicals he orders by mail under agricultural pretenses. The process takes weeks for each piece. She creates purposeful objects. A full vest made of a woman's torso skin, which she can wear over her own clothes. Full face masks that she can strap behind her head, literally transforming into someone else. Lampshades, chair upholstery, a box lined with preserved vulvas. Why? Ed will never give a coherent answer. In his subsequent interrogations, he speaks vaguely of wanting to know what it feels like to be a woman, of needing to have mom around. Psychiatrists will interpret these objects as pathological attempts to literally inhabit his mother's identity, to become her so as to never lose her. By day, Ed Gein is an almost comical figure in Plainfield. His clothes smell musty. His thick glasses magnify eyes that never look directly. He laughs at odd moments, a high-pitched, nervous sound. But he's helpful. When the Hills, his closest neighbors, need help with the harvest, Ed is there. When Bob and Irene Label's family needs an emergency babysitter, Ed readily agrees. The children find him entertaining. He tells silly jokes and entertains them with exaggerated stories. No one suspects that the man who takes care of his children in the afternoon spends his nights in cemeteries, digging graves. In 1950, Ed inherits some money from a distant aunt. It's not much, but enough to stop him from working on neighboring farms. He becomes even more reclusive. Government payments for uncultivated farmland provide him with the bare minimum to survive. The farmhouse is sinking further into disrepair. The roof leaks in multiple places. The windows are so filthy, they barely let in any light. Ed lives mostly in his tiny bedroom and the kitchen. The rest of the house is a chaotic storehouse of junk and macabre treasures. Ed develops what psychiatrists will later identify as dissociative episodes. There are times when he's unsure whether he's Ed Gein or his mother. He speaks to himself in two voices, his own, high-pitched and doubtful, and a deep, stern imitation of Augusta, scolding, instructing, and dominating him. When he dons a human skin vest and straps on a face mask, something changes in his brain. He moves differently. He speaks out loud as if he were a woman. He reenacts entire conversations with a mother who's been dead for years, responding in both roles. Neighbors who pass by the farm on quiet nights sometimes hear voices arguing. They assume Ed has visitors, even though they never see any parked vehicles. The truth is, Ed is having arguments with his own fragmented psyche. It's not schizophrenia in the classic sense. It's something more specific, an identity shattered by decades of psychological abuse, forced isolation, and traumatic loss. Ed Gein doesn't hear voices ordering him to kill. He hears his mother's voice reminding him that he's worthless, sinful, weak, and he desperately tries to please her, even in death. On December 8th, 1954, Mary Hogan disappeared. Mary owns a tavern in Pine Grove, an even smaller town than Plainfield, about 6 miles away. She's 51 years old, robust, and friendly to her customers. Her tavern is a kind of establishment where local farmers drink beer after work, where conversations are easy and friendly. That evening, a regular customer enters and finds the tavern empty. There's blood on the floor behind the bar. A .32 caliber rifle cartridge lies nearby. The cash register is intact. It's not a robbery. Mary Hogan is simply not there. The investigation is immediate but ineffective. Plainfield and the surrounding towns lack the resources for complex forensic investigations. There are no useful fingerprints, no witnesses. Blood indicates foul play, but without a body, there is no definitive murder case. Ed Gein is not a suspect. He has no history of violence. There is no known connection between him and Mary Hogan, except that he occasionally bought beer at her tavern, like dozens of other men. The Mary Hogan case remains unsolved. It becomes a local legend, the kind of haunting mystery residents tell on winter nights. Did she run off with a secret lover? Was she attacked by a stranger while passing by? Is she buried somewhere in the endless woods of Wisconsin? The answer is on the Gein farm, but no one knows yet. 3 years later, when investigators search the farmhouse after Bernice Warden's murder, they find something in a cardboard box in Ed's bedroom. A face mask made of tanned human skin, with gray-tinged brown hair still attached. They will compare it with photographs of Mary Hogan. The similarity is undeniable. Anthropometric measurements will confirm it. It is Mary Hogan's face, preserved as a trophy for 3 years. Ed will admit to killing her. He says it was like being in a dream. He entered the tavern when she was alone. He fired his rifle. He loaded her body into his 1949 Ford pickup truck. He took her to his farm. He decapitated her in the barn and processed her body as he had to exhume corpses. But unlike the women in the cemeteries, Mary was alive when he met her. That crossed a line Ed had avoided for nearly a decade. From grave robber to murderer, the step was smaller than it should have been. After Mary Hogan, Ed continues to live his fragmented life. He continues to work odd jobs. He continues to be the strange but harmless neighbor. The 3 years between 1954 and 1957 pass in a disturbing routine. Days of superficial normality, nights of macabre rituals. Ed spends hours in the barn working on his projects. He organizes his collection of human remains as if they were craft objects. Some days he dresses in his human skin creations and walks around the empty house, speaking in his mother's voice, scolding himself. Other days he simply sits in the kitchen, staring at the walls, lost in thoughts he can never fully articulate. Cemeteries are no longer enough. Decomposed bodies are increasingly difficult to work with. The skin is too deteriorated, the bones too fragile. Ed needs fresh material. And so, on the afternoon of November 16th, 1957, when he walks into Warden's Hardware and sees Bernice standing alone behind the counter, something clicks in his mind. It's not premeditation. Exactly. Ed describes a moment as a fog, as if he were watching himself from afar. What happens next is history. Bernice becomes his second known victim, and this time there will be no hiding it. When officers arrest him that night, while he's quietly having dinner at his neighbor's house, Ed Gein doesn't resist. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't cry or plead. He simply accepts that his secret life is over. But the nightmare for Plainfield in the United States is just beginning. On Monday, November 18th, 1957, forensic teams from the Wisconsin Department of Criminal Justice began the official inventory of the Gein property. What they document over the next 5 days will redefine what law enforcement understands as possible in terms of human depravity. Detective Joseph Wilimowski leads the team. He's a seasoned veteran of World War II who saw combat in Europe. He thinks nothing can surprise him. He's deeply mistaken. The official list of evidence will eventually fill 17 typed pages. Each item is numbered, photographed, and cataloged. But behind the cold bureaucracy of forensic documentation lies something no report can fully capture. The visceral feeling of being in a place where humanity was discarded piece by piece. Ed's center of operations was the kitchen. It's the most functional room in the house, with its wood-burning stove, its hand-pumped sink, and its table covered in objects that are incomprehensible until you look closely. Researchers document. For bowls made from the tops of human skulls, polished and smooth at the edges. One contains rusty buttons. Another holds salt. The skulls have been sawn horizontally, just above the eyebrows, with surprising precision. A collection of 9 full-face masks, each preserved using tanning techniques. Some have the entire scalp intact, with hair ranging from brown to gray. The eye holes are sewn with thick thread. The mouths have been deformed and closed with string. At the back, there are ribbons that allow the masks to be tied around the head. 10 complete human heads in various states of preservation, some reduced to just a skull, others with mummified tissue attached. They are stored in bags and boxes, hanging from nails in the basement beams. A shoebox labeled kitchen utensils contains 9 vulvas preserved in salt. They have been carefully extracted and chemically treated to prevent decomposition. The room where Ed slept is small, barely 3 meters by 4. The bed is a military cot with sheets that haven't been washed in months, maybe years. But it's what surrounds that bed that stops investigators in their tracks. Hanging from homemade hangers is a complete vest made of tanned human skin. It's anatomically shaped. The breasts, navel, and the texture of the abdominal skin are clearly visible. The seams are handmade, but with surprising skill. The vest can be slipped on over clothing, transforming the wearer's torso into a macabre facsimile of a female body. Next to the vest is a pair of leggings made from human leg skin, complete from thighs to ankles. It takes the researchers several minutes to fully comprehend what they're seeing. A belt made of human nipples threaded on a hemp cord hangs from a rusty nail. There are 4 nipples in total, perfectly preserved, strung together like grotesque beads. The lampshades of 2 table lamps are covered with human facial skin. When the light is on, the translucent fabric casts shadows that suggest deformed features. in cardboard boxes under the bed. Female organs preserved in jars with homemade formaldehyde, bones sorted by type and size, loose teeth in a tobacco tin. The Gein farmhouse living room is a chaotic mess of accumulated trash. Newspapers dating back to 1930, pulp magazines, empty cans, broken tools. Investigators must clear piles of debris to access the furniture. When they finally do, they discover that the chairs in the room have seats upholstered with human skin. It's not obvious at first glance because Ed used multiple layers of chemical treatment that darkened material, but forensic analysis leaves no doubt. It's human torso skin, stretched and nailed over the wooden frames of the chairs. A box near the fireplace contains what initially appears to be leather clothing. It's a full suit made of human skin, a second vest, without breast but anatomically complete, with seams that follow the lines of the original body. Researchers find human lips on a string that was hanging from a window frame, swaying slightly in the air current. There's a pair upper and lower, joined but separate from the rest of the face, dry and hardened but unmistakably human. Augusta Gaines' bedroom is located upstairs, at the end of a dark hallway. The door is boarded up with nail boards both inside and out, suggesting that Ed secured the room from the inside before leaving and closing it permanently from the hallway. The researchers carefully remove the planks. When they open the door, a cloud of gray dust rises. The air has a musty, closed smell like a sealed tomb. The room is a time capsule. Augusta's bed is perfectly made, with military-style corners. Her Sunday dress hangs in the closet, protected by a sheet. Her shoes are lined up underneath. Her Bible rests on the nightstand, marked with the book of Leviticus. Her reading glasses are next to the Bible, folded neatly. There's no sign that Ed entered after sealing the room. It's an untouched monument to the woman who destroyed his psyche and became the absolute center of his warped universe. A researcher comments quietly, "This is the most disturbing thing of all. We can understand evil, but this is sick love." The barn, where Bernice Warden's body was hanging when it was discovered, reveals more secrets in daylight. It's a massive structure, with stalls that haven't housed livestock in decades. The beams are solid, capable of supporting considerable weight. Butcher hooks are welded to several beams. Dark stains on the compacted earth floor turn out to be old blood, mixed with lime to mask the smell. In one corner, there's a makeshift workbench, an old door propped on sawhorses, covered in saw marks and stains that chemical analysis confirms as human blood. Ed's tools are arranged with surprising neatness. Saws of various sizes, professionally sharpened butcher knives, an axe with a handle worn from constant use, hooks, and ropes of various kinds. In glass jars are chemicals, alum for tanning hides, formaldehyde for preservation, and salt in industrial quantities. Ed wasn't a chaotic improviser. He was methodical, dedicated to his monstrous craft with the seriousness of craftsmen. Researchers find fragments of women's clothing in a wooden box, 1940s dresses, faded underwear, and odd women's shoes. Each piece of clothing has a story that will never be fully told. After 5 days of exhaustive documentation, the forensic experts present their official tally to the lead investigators. The figures are staggering. Identifiable remains of at least 15 different women, based on bone, cranial, and tissue analysis. This does not include Bernice Warden's, whose complete body was recovered. Of these 15, at least 9 coincide with documented grave desecrations in local cemeteries. The exhumation dates, determined by the state of decomposition, range from 1947 to 1956. 2 additional unsolved missing persons cases. Mary Hogan, confirmed by preserved facial identification, and another woman whose identity will never be determined with certainty, but who may be Evelyn Hartley, a 15-year-old babysitter who disappeared in La Crosse in 1953. However, Ed denies any involvement in the Hartley case. Investigators will never find conclusive evidence linking him to her disappearance, and that particular mystery will remain unsolved. What is clear is this: Ed Gein operated in secret for at least 11 years, creating a private museum of human remains that surpasses in horror anything previously documented in American criminal history. As investigators catalog the horrors, the town of Plainfield enters a state of collective shock. The first news arrives on Sunday, November 17th, the day after the arrest. By Monday, reporters from Milwaukee, Madison, and Chicago had invaded the town of 700. The streets are filled with unfamiliar vehicles. Reporters hound anyone who knew Ed, looking for statements, anecdotes, anything that might explain the inexplicable. Bob Hill, the neighbor who was dining with Ed when he was arrested, refuses to speak to the press. He's in shock. He had invited that man to his table. He had trusted him around his family. The families who used Ed as a babysitter feel a collective nausea. Their children were alone with him. He played pranks on them. He gave them candy. What could have happened? Imagination is crueler than reality in these cases. Sheriff Schley doesn't sleep for 3 days. The way of what he found on that farm will haunt him until his dying day. He will develop alcohol problems and die of a heart attack in 1968 at the age of 57. Some will say Ed Gein killed him as much as he killed Bernice Wardens. Plainfield will never be the same. The town becomes synonymous with horror. For decades, residents will hide their origins when traveling. Where are you from? From Wisconsin. Never from Plainfield. And in a cell in Wautoma, 40 kilometers away, Ed Gein sleeps peacefully for the first time in years, relieved that his secrets are finally out. On November 19, 1957, in an interrogation room at the Washoe County Jail, Ed Gein sits before a team of investigators led by District Attorney Earl Killeen. Ed has spent 3 days in custody. He hasn't asked for a lawyer. He hasn't resisted any questioning. In fact, he seems almost eager to talk. Killeen is a seasoned prosecutor, but nothing in his career prepared him for this. Ed answers questions with a disconcerting calmness. His voice is monotonous, barely audible. He constantly laughs nervously and inappropriately, particularly when describing heinous acts. Why did you do it, Ed? Killeen asks. Ed thinks for a long moment. I guess I just want to see what it was like. He finally answers, how it felt. How did what feel? Being a woman, being a mother. The room falls silent. During 3 interrogation sessions spanning 8 hours in total, Ed admits the following. He desecrated approximately 9 graves in local cemeteries between 1947 and 1954. He can't recall the exact number. Sometimes he dug graves and then changed his mind, filling them again without opening the coffin. Other times he took only specific parts, heads, torso, skin. He murdered Mary Hogan on December 8, 1954. He entered her tavern with his .32 caliber rifle. She was alone. He fired once. He loaded the body into his pickup truck and drove it to his farm. He processed it as he had to exhume bodies, keeping the skull and face as his most prized pieces. He murdered Bernice Wardens on November 16, 1957. The details are similar. Timing, firearm, transportation, prosecution. When asked about other unsolved disappearances in the region, Ed denies any involvement. Investigators press him specifically about Evelyn Hartley, the 15-year-old babysitter who disappeared in La Crosse. Ed insists he knows nothing about her. Investigators aren't entirely convinced. But without physical evidence connecting him to other cases, they can't prove more murders. On November 21st, just 5 days after his arrest, Ed is transferred to Central State Hospital in Waupun for psychiatric evaluation. The decision is both practical and strategic. The prosecutor needs to determine whether Ed is competent to stand trial. Dr. Edward F. Schubert, the institution's chief psychiatrist, conducts the initial evaluations. Ed cooperates fully. He answers questionnaires, participates in interviews, and shows his drawings when asked to express his thoughts visually. The drawings are revealing: dark houses with windows like eyes, faceless female figures, and depictions of his mother with an almost divine aura. In one particularly haunting one, Ed draws himself as a small, hunched figure next to a gigantic Augusta who looks down at him disapprovingly. Dr. Schubert quickly concludes that Ed suffers from schizophrenia, but the diagnosis isn't as simple as it seems. He doesn't experience constant auditory hallucinations or paranoid delusions. His disconnection from reality is more subtle and more specific, an inability to understand that his actions were morally reprehensible. On January 7, 1958, after nearly 2 months of evaluation, Dr. Schubert presented his official report to the court. His conclusion was unequivocal. Edward Gein suffered from severe mental illness and was incompetent to stand trial. He neither fully understood the nature of the charges against him nor could he adequately assist in his own defense. Judge Herbert A. Bund accepts the diagnosis. Ed is formally declared incompetent and committed indefinitely to the Central State Hospital. There will be no immediate trial. There will be no dramatic testimony. There will be no guilty verdict delivered in a packed courtroom. Instead, Ed disappears into Wisconsin's mental health system. The Plainfield community reacts with outrage mixed with relief. Outrage because they feel Ed has evaded justice. Relief because they won't have to relive the horrors in public courtroom testimony. They won't have to see photographs of evidence projected in a courtroom where their neighbors, friends, and family will have to sit on jury duty. On March 30th, 1958, Ed Gein's remaining property was put up for public auction. The farm itself, the barn, the vehicles, and the farm implements untainted by the crime. Thousands of people arrive in Plainfield that day. They aren't serious shoppers. They're morbidly curious, souvenir hunters, people drawn by infamy. The atmosphere is almost like a fair, with street food vendors setting up shop in the town streets. The residents of Plainfield are horrified. This isn't their community. Their town has been turned into a grotesque circus attraction. A group of local citizens, led by merchant Horace G. Greeley, makes a decision. In the early hours of March 20th, a week before the scheduled auction, they burn the Gein farm to the ground. The fire is obviously intentionally set. Firefighters arrive but make little real effort to extinguish the flames. By dawn, the house where Ed Gein lived for 40 years is nothing but ashes and smoldering rubble. The barn, too far removed for fire to spread, survives. It will be demolished by hand weeks later. No one is arrested for the fire. No one admits involvement. It's a public secret, a collective act of cleanup that the law simply chooses to ignore. Ed spent the next 10 years at Waupun State Central Hospital. His life there was routine, almost monotonous. He participated in occupational therapy, worked in the hospital laundry, and read voraciously in the hospital library. The psychiatrists treating him are divided in their opinions. Some believe Ed suffers from full-blown schizophrenia. Others argue that his condition is closer to a severe personality disorder with dissociative episodes. The academic debate continues at conferences and in medical journals. Ed himself is a model patient. He is never violent. He follows the rules meticulously. He develops superficial friendships with other patients. The hospital staff comments that he is polite, almost old-fashioned in his manners. It is difficult to reconcile the quiet man who helps in the laundry with a monster who created objects from human skin. In 1962, Ed's lawyers requested a reevaluation. They argued that his condition had improved with treatment and medication. The request was denied. In 1965, they tried again. Another rejection. Finally, in 1968, 11 years after his arrest, the judicial system decides it is time to review the case. On November 7, 1968, a new psychiatric evaluation determined that Edward Gein had improved significantly. He no longer experienced the severe dissociative episodes that characterized his condition in 1957. He understood the nature of the charges against him. He was able to assist in his defense. He is declared competent to stand trial. The trial for the murder of Bernice Wardens is scheduled to begin on November 7, 1968. Ed is now 62 years old. His hair is completely gray. The thick glasses still magnify his eyes, but there's something different about his expression. Understanding, perhaps, of the magnitude of what he did. The trial doesn't last long. The evidence is overwhelming. Ed doesn't deny the facts. His defense isn't arguing innocence, but rather mental incapacity at the time of the crime. On November 14, 1968, after only a week of trial, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. Their verdict: guilty of the first-degree murder of Bernice Wardens. But there is one crucial stipulation: guilty but legally insane at the time of the crime. Judge Robert H. Golmar delivered the sentence. Ed Gein will not go to prison. Instead, he will be sent to the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, where he will remain indefinitely confined until it is determined that he no longer poses a danger to society. It is In essence, a life sentence in a psychiatric institution. Ed accepts the sentence without any visible reaction. When asked if he has anything to say, he replies in a barely audible voice, "I'm just sorry." Why? Why did he do it? What was going through his mind during those 11 years of secret horror? These questions will never be completely answered. As Ed is escorted from the courtroom, Bernice Worden's family mourns silently. They've waited 11 years for this moment. Justice, long delayed, has finally arrived. But for Plainfield, for the families of the victims whose graves were desecrated, for all those Ed touched with his evil, no verdict can undo what was done. No sentence can restore lost innocence. Ed Gein disappears into the Wisconsin mental health system, where he will spend the last 16 years of his life in relative obscurity. But his legacy, for better or worse, is just beginning to take shape in American culture. In 1959, just 2 years after Ed Gein's arrest, a novelist named Robert Bloch published a book titled Psycho. The story of Norman Bates, a lonely hotelier dominated by his dead mother, who murders a woman in the shower, is fiction, but its roots are firmly planted in Wisconsin. Bloch was living in the state when the Gein case exploded into the headlines. He was fascinated, horrified, inspired. He picked up on specific elements: the rural isolation, the extreme maternal domination, the preservation of the mother's bedroom, the protagonist's inability to separate his identity from hers. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock adapted the novel for film. Psycho became one of the most influential films in the history of cinema. Norman Bates, brilliantly played by Anthony Perkins, became the archetype of the American serial killer. The quiet man, the polite neighbor, the devoted son who hides unimaginable darkness. Ed Gein, in his cell at Waupun, never sees a film. He doesn't fully understand that he's become an unwitting muse for a generation of horror creators. In 1974, director Tobe Hooper released the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The film is introduced with a caption, "Based on true events." Technically, this is true, but the events are from Wisconsin, not Texas. The character of Leatherface, the masked killer who wears a butcher's apron and a mask made of human skin, is a direct transposition of elements from the Gein case. The isolated farmhouse filled with human remains turned into decoration. The leather-upholstered furniture, the face masks. It's all there, augmented for cinematic effect, but fundamentally inspired by the documented reality in Plainfield. The film became a cult sensation, banned in several countries for its graphic violence. It spawned franchises, remakes, and endless sequels. Leatherface became a horror icon as recognizable as Dracula or Frankenstein. And it all started with a Wisconsin farmer who did things that fiction could barely exaggerate. In 1988, novelist Thomas Harris published The Silence of the Lambs. The character of Buffalo Bill, the killer who kidnaps women, kills them, and skins them to create a suit of human skin, is another direct descendant of Ed Gein. Harris is more explicit about his influences. In the novel, FBI agent Jack Crawford specifically mentions Ed Gein while profiling Buffalo Bill. The elements are unmistakable. The desire to become a woman to the skin of his victims, the combination of necrophilia and macabre craftsmanship, the fractured psychology of a man who never resolved his relationship with his mother. When the film was adapted by Jonathan Demme in 1991, Buffalo Bill became one of the most terrifying depictions of mental illness in cinema. The scene where he dances in front of the mirror with human skin over his body is a direct reenactment of what Ed confessed to doing on his farm. The film won 5 Oscars, including Best Picture. Ed Gein, from his cell at the Mendota Mental Health Institute, has no idea that his legacy has become award-winning art. Ed Gein's impact on American horror culture cannot be underestimated. Before him, murders in fiction were mostly foreign, aristocratic, exotic. Dracula Transylvania, The Phantom of the Opera, sophisticated criminals from mystery novels. Ed showed that genuine evil could exist in ordinary places, among ordinary people, in small towns where everyone knows each other. He created the template for the American serial killer, the solitary, socially maladjusted white male with childhood trauma and maternal fixation. Dozens of films, hundreds of novels, thousands of stories use elements of his case. Deranged, 1974, a low-budget film that recreates the Gein case almost verbatim, changing only names and locations. Ed Gein, 2000, a direct biopic starring Steve Railsback. Ed Gein, The Butcher of Plainfield, 2007, another film adaptation. References in television series such as Criminal Minds, Mindhunter, American Horror Story. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and books keep returning to Plainfield, dissecting the same events from slightly different angles. Plainfield, Wisconsin, never asked to be famous, but infamy came anyway. In the 1960s and 1970s, when films inspired by Ed Gein became popular, a disturbing phenomenon began: horror tourism. Visitors come to town looking for the location of the Gein farm, which was burned and demolished decades ago. They want to see where Warden's hardware store used to be, which was closed and converted into another business. They seek out the cemetery where Ed was eventually buried, taking pictures next to his gravestone as if it were a tourist attraction. Plainfield residents hate this. They've tried for decades to distance themselves from the case. There are no commemorative plaques, no crime museums, no guided tours. The town refuses to capitalize on its darkest history, but they can't control what happens outside their borders. In nearby towns, souvenir shops sell T-shirts with Ed's face, mugs with phrases like Plainfield's finest, and macabre postcards. It's a trade in horror that disgusts people who actually experience the trauma. Ed Gein's grave in Plainfield Cemetery becomes a target of repeated vandalism. His headstone is stolen multiple times. Souvenir hunters break it into pieces, taking fragments as trophies. Eventually, the headstone is permanently removed and placed in a private location for safekeeping. Even in death, Ed Gein can't find peace, and Plainfield can't escape his shadow. Amid all the cultural fascination with Ed Gein, it's easy to forget the real people whose lives he destroyed. Bernice Wardens was 58 years old when she was murdered. She had a son who loved her. She had customers who depended on her hardware store. She was a real person with dreams, memories, a life that mattered. Mary Hogan was 51 years old. She ran her tavern alone, served weary farmers, and probably knew the life stories of most of her regular customers. Her passing left a void that was never properly filled. The women whose bodies were exhumed from cemeteries were real people too. They had lived full lives, died of natural causes, and were buried by families who loved them. The fact that Ed desecrated them after death doesn't make them any less victims of his evil. Their families had to live with the knowledge that the remains of their loved ones had been violated, objectified, and dehumanized in the most literal way possible. Some families chose to exhume and rebury the remains in secret locations. Others simply tried to forget, even though knowledge makes complete forgetting impossible. When popular culture celebrates Ed Gein as a fascinating figure, when filmmakers turn him into an inspiration, when tourists seek out his grave for selfies, the victims disappear from the narrative. But they should be the center of the story, not the monster that destroyed them. Ed Gein's case sparked debates that continue in the psychiatric community to this day. Was he truly schizophrenic? Or was his diagnosis a legal convenience to avoid the death penalty? Some psychiatrists argue that Ed exhibited classic symptoms of psychosis: delusions about becoming his mother, severe dissociation from reality, and an inability to comprehend the immorality of his actions. According to this interpretation, he was genuinely insane and deserved treatment, not punishment. Others argue that Ed knew exactly what he was doing. He meticulously concealed his crimes. He waited until Bernice was alone to kill her. He lied when necessary. These are the actions of someone who understands the social consequences of their actions, not someone completely divorced from reality. A third group suggests that Ed suffered from something more complex than schizophrenia, a dissociative identity disorder combined with necrophiliacism and extreme fetishism, all rooted in developmental trauma from maternal psychological abuse. The debate was never definitively resolved. Ed remained officially diagnosed as schizophrenic until his death, but medical consensus on his true condition remains elusive. What is not up for debate is this: Ed Gein was a product of a catastrophic combination of factors: genetics, environment, trauma, isolation, and the destructive influence of a deeply ill mother who projected her own pathology onto a vulnerable child. The question that haunts every analysis of the Ed Gein case is simple but impossible to fully answer. Why? Why would a man who was capable of kindness to children, who never showed violence before the age of 48, who functioned in society albeit marginally, suddenly begin exhuming corpses and eventually killing? The most common answer is Augusta's death. When she died in 1945, Ed's only anchor to reality broke. He went from being a controlled but functional son to a completely lost man, without the figure who defined every aspect of his existence. But that doesn't explain why he chose the specific path he did. Millions of people lose parents without becoming grave robbers. Thousands of people suffer childhood abuse without creating objects from human skin. Perhaps the truth is there's no singular answer. Ed Gein was a confluence of rare factors: a genetic predisposition to mental illness, extreme psychological abuse for decades, total social isolation, exposure to distorted religious ideology, traumatic loss with no support systems, and access to specific skills, leather tanning, that facilitated his actions. It was a perfect storm of factors that created a monster. And when that monster finally emerged from the shadows in November 1957, it forever changed the way America understands evil. The Mendota Mental Health Institute, where Ed Gein spent his last 16 years, is a maximum security institution located in Madison, Wisconsin. It's a place for the criminally insane, those who committed heinous crimes but were deemed unfit to face conventional prison. Ed arrives there in 1968, after his trial. He's 62 years old, his hair completely gray, his posture hunched from decades of manual labor. He's assigned to a single cell in the maximum security wing. His daily life is structured with institutional rigidity. Wake up at 6 in the morning, breakfast at 7, therapy or occupational work from 9 to 11, lunch at noon, supervised free time in the afternoons, dinner at 5, lights out at 9 at night. Ed adjusts surprisingly well. The hospital staff notes that he is a model patient, polite, cooperative, never violent. He participates in all scheduled activities. He reads voraciously in the institution's library, preferring westerns and adventure novels. He develops superficial friendships with other patients, though he never talks about his case. Some of his fellow patients know who he is. Of course, Ed Gein is famous. But in Mendota, even infamy becomes routine. Throughout the 1970s, several psychiatrists, criminologists, and writers requested interviews with Ed. Most were turned down. Ed wasn't interested in being studied as a curious specimen, but he occasionally agreed to talk, particularly with medical professionals who approached him with respect rather than sensationalism. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. George Arndt conducts several sessions with Ed in 1973. His notes reveal a deeply fragmented but more self-aware man than in 1957. Ed admits that he wasn't right when he did the things he did. He acknowledges that his actions were bad and that he hurt people. But when pressed for specific motivations, he becomes vague and contradictory. "I guess I just needed Mom," he says in a session, "and when she left, I tried to keep her close in any way I could." When Dr. Arndt asks about the human skin masks, Ed replies, "Sometimes I would put them on and pretend to be her. I could hear her voice telling me what to do." Auditory hallucinations, delusions, or just Ed's way of rationalizing the irrational. Dr. Arndt is never completely sure. Ed Gein doesn't receive visitors. He has no living family after his mother's death. He has no close friends from Plainfield willing to travel to Madison to see him. Neighbors who once thought he was harmless now prefer to pretend he never existed. He occasionally receives letters. Some are from morbidly curious people asking for details of his crimes. These are intercepted by hospital staff and never reach Ed. Others are from psychology or criminology students requesting interviews for dissertations or research. Ed rarely responds. There are a handful of letters from religious people offering prayers or spiritual redemption. Ed reads some of these. Once, he tells a psychiatrist that he'd like to believe God can forgive him, but he's not sure it's possible. After all, Mom always said some sins are unforgivable. Even after decades of treatment, Augusta Gein's voice continues to resonate in her son's psyche. In 1978, Ed is diagnosed with cancer. It begins in his lungs, likely the result of decades of exposure to its smoke on the farm without proper ventilation. The cancer slowly spreads over the next few years. Ed receives basic treatment at the Mendota Infirmary, but no aggressive interventions. He is 72 years old. His body is worn down by a lifetime of hard work and decades of institutional confinement. The hospital staff notices that Ed accepts the illness with the same passivity he has accepted everything else in his life. He doesn't complain about the pain. He doesn't ask about prognosis. He simply continues his daily routine as much as his body allows. By 1983, the cancer had spread extensively. Ed was permanently transferred to the hospital's infirmary. He spent most of his days in bed, reading when he had the energy, sleeping when he didn't. Doctors estimate that he has months, maybe weeks left. In his final weeks, Ed occasionally spoke with the nurses caring for him. One of them, Sarah Mitchell, recalled in later interviews that Ed seemed to be coming to terms with something, though she never specified what. "I did bad things," Ed tells her one June afternoon. "I hurt people who didn't deserve to be hurt." Sarah simply replies, "Yes, he did." Ed nods. "Do you think Mom will forgive me?" The question is so unexpected, so absurdly disconnected from reality, that Sarah doesn't know how to answer. Augusta Gein, the woman who psychologically destroyed her son, who planted the seeds of his monstrosity. Would that woman forgive him? "I don't know, Ed," Sarah finally says. "But maybe you should ask yourself if you can forgive yourself." Ed thinks about this for a long moment. Then he says simply, "No." It's the most honest admission he'll ever make. Edward Theodore Gein died on July 26, 1984 at 6:40 a.m. The official cause was respiratory failure secondary to metastatic lung cancer. He was 77 years old. There is no public funeral. There is no obituary in the major newspapers. The death of one of America's most infamous killers passes with remarkable silence. His body is claimed by the state of Wisconsin. After deliberation, it is decided that he will be buried in the Plainfield Cemetery, in the family plot next to his mother Augusta and his brother Henry. The residents of Plainfield are not consulted about this decision. When they find out, there are protests. How dare they bring that monster back? How dare they bury him alongside the people he psychologically destroyed? But the protests are ignored. Ed Gein returns to Plainfield for the last time. The burial takes place at dawn, before the town has woken up, before journalists can arrive. Only 3 people are present: the cemetery manager, a state representative, and a local pastor who agrees to recite a brief prayer. There is no headstone initially, only a temporary marker with an identification number. The exact location of the grave is not made public, precisely to avoid morbid tourism. But secrets are hard to keep in a small town. By the end of the year, people know where Ed Gein is buried, and the pilgrimage of the curious begins. In 1985, a simple gravestone was placed with his name, dates of birth, and death, nothing more. In 1988, the gravestone was vandalized, covered with red paint. It was cleaned but vandalized again weeks later. In 2000, the tombstone was completely stolen. Pieces of it eventually appeared on eBay, sold as authentic souvenirs for hundreds of dollars. A new tombstone is placed, and almost immediately it too disappears. Eventually, the cemetery authorities simply stop replacing it. Ed Gein's grave exists, but without a permanent marker. It's an unmarked grave in a small cemetery, the unmarked final resting place of a man whose name is known around the world. More than 40 years have passed since Ed Gein's death, 70 since his crimes. And yet, his name persists in the American cultural consciousness. Every few years, a new film, a new documentary, a new podcast rediscovers their story. Each generation must process anew the reality that such horrors aren't just fiction, that they really happened, that true evil can exist in ordinary places. Plainfield still hates the attention. The town now has fewer than 700 residents, even fewer than in 1957. Many families left decades ago, tired of being associated with horror. Those who remain simply want to live their lives without curious tourists taking pictures on their streets. Warden's hardware store closed decades ago. The building now houses an antique shop, ironically marketing nostalgia for the past in a town that would rather forget its most famous history. The Gein farm site is now just an empty field. Vegetation has reclaimed the land. There are no signs, no markers, nothing to indicate that one of America's most infamous crime scenes once existed there. But Ed Gein's legacy can't be erased so easily. It's etched into horror fiction, criminology, forensic psychology, and the collective consciousness of a nation that learned that real monsters don't wear capes or fangs. They wear overalls and thick glasses. They smile nervously. They seem harmless. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying lesson of all. Decades after his death, the Ed Gein case still raises questions without definitive answers. Official files are sealed or lost. Key witnesses have died. Records have been destroyed or privatized. What remains is an incomplete story, fragmented by time and deliberate secrecy. How many graves did he actually desecrate? Ed confessed approximately 9, but investigators found remains of at least 15 different individuals. Are the discrepancies due to Ed's poor memory, unfinished exhumations, or additional victims who were never identified? Did he kill his brother Henry? The circumstances of Henry's death in 1944 remain suspicious. Bruises on the head, death in an unburned area, Ed leading rescuers directly to the body. But there was never enough evidence to charge him. The truth died with Ed. What happened to Evelyn Hartley, the 15-year-old babysitter, who disappeared from La Crosse in 1953? Ed adamantly denied any involvement. Investigators never found physical evidence connecting him to her disappearance. But the location, timing, and victim profile are an eerie fit. Evelyn Hartley remains an unsolved missing person. Were there other murder victims besides Bernice Wardens and Mary Hogan? Ed insisted there weren't. But can we trust the word of a man whose relationship with reality was so fragmented? Most of the physical evidence in the Ed Gein case was destroyed. Wisconsin authorities, understandably, did not want to preserve artifacts of horror in their archives. After the 1968 trial, the decision was made to incinerate most of the human remains and fabricated artifacts. But some items disappeared before that. During the chaos of the initial investigation in November 1957, when thousands of curious onlookers descended on Plainfield, several objects were stolen from a crime scene or from stored evidence. Supposedly, bone fragments, unofficial photographic evidence. Even small pieces of Ed's belongings are in private hands. True crime collectors, black market dealers, people with morbid fascinations. In 2012, an online auction claimed to be selling certified bone fragments from the Gein farm. The authenticity was never independently verified, but the items sold for thousands of dollars. Ed's car, his 1949 Ford pickup truck that he used to transport his victims' bodies, was sold at public auction for just over $200 in 1958. The buyer exhibited it at traveling fairs and carnivals for years, charging 25 cents per view. The vehicle eventually disappeared, its current whereabouts unknown. These are the macabre relics of a case that refuses to remain buried. The Ed Gein case marked a turning point in how the United States understands and studies violent crime. Before him, serial killers were largely unstudied phenomena. After him, they became the subject of intensive scientific study. In 1972, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit established its criminal profiling program. Agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas began interviewing convicted murderers to develop psychological profiles that could help solve active cases. Ed Gein, though never directly interviewed by the FBI, he died before they could access him, became a pivotal case study. His profile is featured in Quantico, the disorganized killer, driven by psychosis and compulsion, with opportunistic rather than carefully selected victims. Douglas and Ressler would eventually codify serial killer types. Ed fit the disorganized, mission-oriented killer category, albeit with unique elements that defied simple categorization. The concept of trophies taken from victims, now standard in criminal profiling, was widely studied following the Gein case. The objects Ed created weren't simply mementos. They were transformations, attempts to literally incorporate his victims into his life and identity. Why does Ed Gein continue to fascinate us 70 years later? The answer is complex and reveals as much about us as it does about him. There's an element of incomprehensibility. Ed's crimes are so extreme, so far removed from normal human experience, that they defy complete empathy. We can't imagine doing what he did, and that distance allows us to observe without feeling like we're looking in a mirror. There's also a disturbing paradox. Ed was simultaneously monstrous and insignificant. He wasn't a criminal genius. He wasn't impossibly cunning. He was a mediocre, socially awkward farmer who lived in almost total obscurity until he was discovered. The banality of his evil is, in some ways, more terrifying than if he had been an elaborately malevolent villain. And there's an element of easy morality. Ed Gein allows for discussions of right and wrong, sanity and insanity, nature versus nurture, without complicated moral ambiguity. There's no one defending what he did. There's no debate about whether he was truly evil. It's, in that sense, a safe case for exploring the limits of human darkness. But this fascination comes at a cost. Every time we celebrate Ed Gein as a fascinating cultural figure, we marginalize his victims. Every time we buy a t-shirt with his image or watch another film adaptation, we are participating in the commercialization of real trauma. Bernice Wardens had a life before November 16th, 1957. She was a widow, having raised a son alone while running a business. She was known in Plainfield as fair but firm in her dealings, friendly to regular customers, and respected in the community. Her son, Frank, lived with the trauma of finding the crime scene, of learning how his mother died, of living for decades in a town that became synonymous with horror. He never fully recovered. He died in 1994, taking with him memories he never fully shared. Mary Hogan was divorced, independent, a woman who ran her own business in an era when that was unusual. Her regular customers remember her as having a dry sense of humor, and that she could handle troublesome drunks firmly but without cruelty. She disappeared one Saturday afternoon and wasn't found for 3 years. The women whose bodies were exhumed, Eleanor Adams, Mabel Everson, Mary Hogan, a different Mary, and others whose names aren't always mentioned in a count of case. They had lived full lives. They had been mothers, wives, daughters, sisters. They had died peacefully and were buried by families who loved them. Ed Gein even robbed them of the dignity of death. And history, in its obsession with the monster, often forgets the people he destroyed. If Ed Gein's case should teach us anything, it's that extreme isolation, psychological abuse, and untreated mental illness create fertile ground for tragedy. But more than half a century later, these lessons remain largely ignored. How many potential Ed Geins exist right now, isolated in rural areas, without access to mental health services, raised in abusive environments that no one sees because it happens behind closed doors? The system that allowed Augusta Gein to psychologically torture her children for decades without intervention still exists. The stigma that prevents people from seeking help for mental illness persists. The lack of resources for mental health services in rural areas remains critical. Plainfield in 1957 was a town where everyone knew everyone, but no one really knew Ed Gein. No one asked why a 40-year-old man lived completely isolated. No one intervened when his mother controlled him with obvious psychological cruelty. No one offered support when she died, and he clearly couldn't handle the loss. This pattern is repeated constantly in cases of extreme violence. Ignored signals, delayed intervention, help offered too late. Plainfield in 2025 is an aging town with fewer residents than 70 years ago. The dairy farms that once dominated the local economy have largely been replaced by corporate agriculture. Young people are leaving for bigger cities. Houses are empty. Businesses are closed. The town actively tries not to be defined by its darker history. There's no Ed Gein museum, no true crime tours, no signs marking significant locations. When journalists or filmmakers come asking about Ed, residents generally refuse to cooperate. There's a whole generation of people living in Plainfield who weren't alive when Ed was arrested. For them, it's ancient history, as relevant as any other event from the 1950s. But the shadow lingers. Attempts to develop local tourism are constantly sabotaged by the association with Ed Gein. Who wants a vacation in the town where the Plainfield butcher lived? Potential investors are shunning it. New businesses are struggling to establish themselves. The people are in a very real sense, still being victimized by a man who died 40 years ago. On a cold November morning, 70 years after Bernice Warden's disappeared from her hardware store, Plainfield remains quiet. The wind blows through empty fields where the Gein farm once stood. The cemetery where Ed lies unmarked is silent, except for the occasional sound of dry leaves being blown by the wind. There's no perfect resolution to this story. There's no neat moral. There's no cathartic moment where everything makes sense. What remains is this: a reminder that true evil is rarely dramatic. It's banal, ordinary, hidden behind nervous smiles and seemingly simple lives. It's a product of untreated pain, untreated isolation, unrecognized illness. Ed Gein wasn't born a monster. He was created, piece by piece, by an abusive mother, an absent father, enforced isolation, a society that failed to intervene when it should have, and a vulnerable psyche that broke under unbearable pressure. This doesn't excuse what he did. Nothing can. The victims deserve justice, memory, respect. Their families deserve peace, which they will never fully find. But understanding how monsters are created is crucial to preventing more from occurring. Every Ed Gein is a collective failure of family, of community, of society, of systems that should protect the vulnerable and treat the sick. The farm is in ashes. The man lies in an unmarked grave. But the legacy persists not just in films and documentaries, but in every unreported case of abuse, in every person with mental illness who goes untreated, in every community that ignores signs because looking is uncomfortable. Ed Gein's story isn't just about one man and his horrific crimes. It's about all of us, about the things we choose to see and the things we choose to ignore, about the fine line between humanity and monstrosity, and how easily that line can be crossed when no one is watching. Plainfield is still a small town in Wisconsin. Ed Gein is still a name that sends shivers down your spine. And the questions his life and crimes raise remain unanswered, waiting for each new generation to rediscover them and, perhaps, learn something the previous ones couldn't. 70 years are not enough to erase what happened in Plainfield between 1945 and 1957. Time does not heal all wounds, especially those inflicted so deeply on the collective psyche of community and a nation. In sealed files at Wisconsin psychiatric hospitals lie documents that will never be fully public. Psychiatric evaluations of Ed Gein, transcripts of therapy sessions, drawings he made during his confinement. These documents contain insights that can inform our understanding of the criminal mind, but they remain protected by medical privacy laws that survive even the patient's death. In cardboard boxes in Wisconsin basements are crime scene photographs that have never been released, too graphic, too disturbing even for the internet age where everything seems available. The investigators who saw them in 1957 carried those images in their minds until their own deaths. In the minds of the few survivors who knew Ed personally, who dined with him, who confided in him with their children, there are memories that can't be fully shared. The visceral feeling of having been close to evil without recognizing it. Survivor's guilt. The lingering question, could I have done something differently? And in American popular culture, in films released every year, in television series exploring the minds of serial killers, in podcasts dissecting true crime cases, the echo of Ed Gein resonates incessantly. Norman Bates at the Bates Motel, his mother's voice echoing in his head. Leatherface brandishing his chainsaw, wearing his grotesque human skin mask. Buffalo Bill in his basement, shouting, "I'd put my skin in your skin," while dancing in front of camera. Hannibal Lecter discussing the motivations of serial killers with Clarice Starling, using Ed Gein as a prime example. They are all fictional children of a real man who lived on a ramshackle farm and did things that fiction can hardly exaggerate. The final question, the one that persists beyond all others, is this: what do we do with this story? Do we bury it, as Plainfield desperately wants to do, pretending that if we don't talk about it, it will cease to exist? Do we exploit it, as Hollywood has repeatedly done, turning real trauma into marketable entertainment? Do we study it, as criminologists argue we should, drawing lessons that might prevent future tragedies? Do we remember her, as the families of the victims deserve, by focusing on the people who were destroyed rather than the monster who destroyed them? Perhaps the answer is all of the above and none. Perhaps some events are too complex, Too obscure, too fundamentally disturbing to be fully processed by a single generation or discipline. What is certain is this: as long as there is a human capacity for cruelty, as long as there are systems that fail the vulnerable, as long as there's abuse that breaks young minds and isolation that allows madness to flourish unwitnessed, there will be more Ed Geins. Not exactly like him, of course. Each monster is unique in the details of their monstrosity, but the pattern will persist. Trauma, isolation, untreated mental illness, ignored signs, delayed or absent intervention, and ultimately, violence that destroys lives and communities. The farm is in ashes. The man is underground without a name. But the story lives on, passed down from generation to generation, mutating with each retelling, losing details, gaining mythology, becoming something more than facts. A parable, a warning, a dark mirror that reflects the aspect of humanity we prefer not to see. And in Plainfield, Wisconsin, the wind continues to blow across empty fields, carry with it secrets that will never be fully revealed, and a question that will never be fully answered. How could this happen here? The answer, so long after, is simply because it can happen anywhere, and that perhaps is the most terrifying lesson of all.